Okay, it's just after 4 o'clock, so we will call the meeting to order. And I'll start by saying that the City of London is committed to making every effort to provide alternate formats and communication supports for council, standing or advisory committee meetings, and information upon request. To make a request for any city service, please contact accessibility@london.ca or 519-661-2489, extension 2425. To make a request specific to this meeting, please contact pec@london.ca. I will now look to the committee for any disclosures of pecuniary interest. I'm seeing none. So we have a number of consent items. Are there any items that members would like pulled? I'm not seeing any, so I need a motion. Councillor Hopkins is moving all of the consent items. I need a second. Seconded by Councillor Kayabaga. Any comments, questions? Councillor Deputy Mayor Helmer.
Thank you very much. Just briefly on the building division report. I know this is kind of like a broken record. I almost say it every month, but a tremendous building activity in the city, supported ably by our staff. I know it's a very busy time, and backing out even the very large addition that I'm sure is attributable to the Maple Leaf Foods facility is another year like where we're in November and we're at $1 billion in the construction activity plus on top of that, the Maple Leaf facility, which is another $300 million. I mean, this is shaping up to be one of the strongest years on record. And it seems like it's, obviously there's some increases in the number of units. We're seeing higher, but really a lot of construction value increases. And I wonder if there's anything in particular on that front that our staff want to comment on, because it's a strong year in terms of the kind of things that are being built and the number of units that are being created, but it's also large increases in the construction value.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Helmer, and through you, Madam Chair. I obviously echo the same sentiment. I said this morning that I'm done forecasting, because when we hit the $1 billion mark 3 years in a row, I thought that was pretty much it. I wasn't expecting a fourth year in a row. And I just had a bit of a sneak preview into the December numbers. So we're probably around the 1.4 million overall in terms of the year. Yes, staff have struggled to keep up, and we're around the 89% mark in terms of issuing permits on time. But once again, it looks like another healthy year this year. And again, I'm not making any comments for next year. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And earlier today at Corporate Services Committee, we saw the related report about assessment growth. And certainly it was in the top for the last 20 years. It was, I think, number 4 or 5 out of the last 20-year period, and it's related, right? The more things that are being built, the higher the value of those things, the more it helps pay for the cost of growth. And so thanks for all the work that you're doing in your team.
Great, thank you, Mr. Carlson. Thanks, Deputy Mayor Helmer. Also, you know, Deputy Mayor Helmer touched on the work of staff, and I also want to mention that dealing with these kinds of numbers and with an 89% on time report card, I think that staff are doing very well considering the workload and considering that we still need more people in that department. So I do appreciate, and I'm sure that the community appreciates the hard work that staff are putting in to get these building permits out the door and keep things moving along. So thank you very much. Any other questions or concerns? So with that, I will call the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
So we'll move to item 3.2 with the scheduled items, just because our delegation is not here yet. And that's a public participation meeting for 332 Central Ave and 601 Waterloo Street. And I need a motion to open the PPM. Moved by Councillor Keabaga, seconded by Deputy Mayor Helmer. And we can vote on that.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
So before we begin, I'll look to the gallery to see if there is anyone here to hear this item, and that is the application for 332 Central Ave and 601 Waterloo Street. Is there anyone in the public gallery who is looking to hear about this item or speak to this item? I'm not seeing any. So, committee, do you need a formal presentation from staff on this item? I'm not seeing any. So just a quick 2 or 3 minute, 1 or 2 minute introduction on this item would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So this is a city-initiated official plan amendment as well as a zoning bylaw amendment application pertaining to the property municipally addressed as 332 Central Avenue and 601 Waterloo Street. So the city-initiated official plan amendment will add a policy to Chapter 10, Policies for Specific Areas, to permit the personal service establishment use and align the 1989 official plan as it applies to these lands with the policies of the London Plan. So the applicant is requesting to add a personal service establishment use within the existing building together with at least one dwelling unit. The site is currently zoned residential R3 special provision with an office conversion on there as well, and they're seeking to rezone it to maintain that residential R3 special provision zone and adding a special provision to the existing office conversion zone on the property. And the special provisions are requested to permit a minimum of 5 parking spaces and to recognize existing site conditions with respect to setbacks, landscape open space, lot area, lot coverage, as well as all existing setbacks to be maintained on the date of the passing of the bylaw. There was a low response from the public regarding the subject application, and staff are in support of the recommended amendments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is the applicant here?
Through you, Madam Chair, my name is Caitlin Crowley. I'm here with Zelinka Priamo on behalf of the owner. I would just like to thank Melanie Vivian for her work on this file, and we are in agreement with the staff recommendation in the staff report and are here to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Any technical questions from committee? No? Oh, yes, Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd be happy to move this recommendation. I'm in support of it. I understand there's already a business on this property. Oh. Sorry, no technical questions, so I'm being told that we've got to close the PPM first.
Thanks very much. Any members of the public wish to speak to this item? Nobody here that would like to comment or ask questions about this? Okay, so I will look to the committee to close. Councillor Keabaga, seconded by Councillor Hopkins.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
Councillor Hopkins, do you have a comment?
I do now. I'm happy to support this recommendation moving forward. There's already an existing business on at this location. I do have a quick question for you to staff, for anyone that may be interested in knowing a little bit more about personal service establishments. What is allowed in a personal service establishment?
Through you, Madam Chair, there can be usage such as like a hair salon, a day spa, so those types of things.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Any other questions, committee, comments? No. So the recommendation has been moved by Councillor Hopkins, a second from Councillor Keabaga, and we can vote on that.
Councillor Kayavaga.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
Okay, we'll circle back to item 3.1, and we have a delegation from Mr. Dudek, the Chair of the London Advisory Committee on Heritage. If you want to come to the podium, and go ahead, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple quick things to discuss tonight. First off is the, and most importantly, is the demolition request for the heritage listed property at 247 Mills, or Halls Mills Road. Staff asked us to come to speak to that one specifically. The committee latch was unanimous in the support of staff's recommendation to designate the property. A lot of obviously reasons, historical reasons, contextual reasons, architectural reasons as well. So there was a good discussion on the kind of the heritage attributes of both buildings, but ultimately we were explained in great detail by staff as to why the attributes were why they were what they were, and we were very supportive of those reasons, and as such it was a unanimous decision for us to support staff's recommendation. The only other thing I would probably worthy of note to discuss is that we were tasked with looking forward to our 2020 work plan, as I believe all of the advisory committees were to do. We were able to whittle it down from probably about 30 items to about 15 items, which we are happy to bring forward. I think that the thing to take away from that was that there was a lot of successful items that have occurred in the last couple of years. I think specifically of Heritage Places 2.0, matters such as that. So projects that were wrapped up, archaeological master plan and whatnot. So it was good to see that. I think the focus of our of 2020 will be supporting some of the transit initiatives, supporting staff in those regards. And then along with our day-to-day, duties, or month-to-month, I guess, specifically, working on heritage matters, specifically of heritage alteration permits and whatnot. So that's basically all there was to discuss from that meeting, though. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks very much. Any questions for Mr. Dudek? So we need a motion then to receive the delegation and the report from the latch, and it's moved by Councillor Hopkins, seconded by Councillor Kayavaga, and we can vote on that.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
That brings us to the next item, which is 3.3, the public participation meeting for the demolition request for heritage listed property at 247 Halls Mill Road. And I need somebody to move to open that, and it's moved by Councillor Kayavaga, seconded by Councillor Hopkins.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
So I believe this is an item of interest. So we have a presentation on this item. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. This is a demolition request for the accessory building located on the heritage listed property at 247 Halls Mill Road. For some contextual information, the property is approximately 1 acre. It's located on the west side of Halls Mill Road, just north of Commissioners Road West, and it is located in the former Westminster Township, now the village of Byron, which was annexed by the City of London in 1961. As noted, it is a heritage listed property, and its listing came into force and effect in 2007, but it's been on previous heritage registers and inventories dating back to the 1990s. It includes a dwelling as well as an accessory building known locally as the Red Barn. So there are two structures located on the property, the first of which is a buff brick cottage. The cottage is a 1.5-story buff brick dwelling with Queen Anne Revival stylistic influences. And it includes a hipped roof with cross gables on the northeast and south sides. There are also porches located on the north and south elevations, and various additions have been added to the rear, the west facade of the dwelling, including a 2-car garage. The property also includes a 2-story accessory building, which is the subject of this demolition request. The building is of timber frame construction and is connected through the use of mortise and tenon joinery, which is a traditional timber framing construction method. The cladding on the exterior of the building consists of red painted chestnut board and batten siding. And in terms of its design details, it includes a projecting center gable with a round-headed window, a hipped roof that extends over the bay door, and a central ventilator. Beyond its appearance as a barn, the building has also historically been used as a coach house, as well as a warehouse for a historic woolen mill that was located across the street on the property that is now known as Halls Mill Park. The subject building, as well as the subject property, as well as its structures, have been noted in various published local histories, including historical sketches of London from Site to City by Nancy Towski. This is the sketch that accompanies the description of the property. And in her description, Towski notes the center section of the building with the round-headed window, the projecting gable, the main door, and its hipped roof, the ventilator, and some concern for symmetry as well, noted by the presence of the 2 ground floor windows. She also describes the building as one of the most impressive coach houses left in London. In terms of the property's history, the property at 247 Halls Mill Road was originally a part of Lot 45 Concession B along the Broken Front in Westminster Township. The lot was approximately 120 acres when it was granted in 1819 to Archibald McMillan, the original grantee. In the 1820s, portions of the properties began to be subdivided and sold to various individuals who utilized the geographic location of the property for milling purposes. And portions of the properties were sold to individuals such as Burley Hunt, who went into partnership with Cyrenius Hall, who is perhaps one of the most well-known of milling figures associated with the early history of Byron, as well as, of course, the namesake for Hall's Mills. The Griffith brothers, for whom the property is most notably associated, began acquiring property in the area beginning in 1861. John, William, and Eli, who were 3 brothers, all children of Eli and Alexandria Griffith, early settlers in Westminster Township, eventually acquired various properties in Halls Mill and opened a woolen milling operation known as the Griffith Brothers Woolen Mills. Their mill was located, as I noted, across the road from what is now 247 Halls Mill Road on the property known as Halls Mill Park. Their mill closed in the 1890s, and they sold the milling property, to the City of London. William Griffith, one of the 3 brothers, lived at 247 Halls Mill Road and owned the property until he passed away in the 1920s. So just to give you some further contextual information on this property as well as this application, there's been a few demolition and designation requests on the property, so there has a bit of a short chain of events. In 2008, the property was the subject of a demolition application. The application was approved. However, the permit was revoked in 2009 due to non-action. And at that time, the Latch also objected to the demolition request. Fast forwarding to 2019, in September 2019, complaints were brought to the city's attention about the potential demolition activities for the accessory building, namely the removal of the roof sheathing. A code compliance inspector advised the owner at the time that a demolition permit would be required for any demolition work. Oops. And then later on in November 2019, a request for designation of the property under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act was brought forward by community members. That request was referred to the Stewardship Subcommittee of Latch for research and evaluation, but one thing to note is due to the scheduling of meetings in December, the Stewardship Subcommittee was not able to undertake extensive research before the demolition request was received. In the same month, further complaints were brought to the city's attention about the ongoing removal of materials from the accessory building, despite city orders to cease demolition activities. At the end of November 2019, the property owner consulted with heritage planners on the required approval process for demolition on a heritage listed property. At that time, the owner was advised of the 60-day review period that would commence upon receipt of written intent to demolish a building or structure on a heritage-listed property. On December 10th, 2019, the roof of the accessory building collapsed, causing a portion of the second story to collapse as well. A complete demolition application was submitted to the city on December 13th, 2019. So right now we are in the 60-day review period when municipal council must respond to a notice to demolish a building or structure on a heritage listed property within 60 days. So the options are either to consent to the demolition or designate the property under the Ontario Heritage Act. So just a few photographs. This is dating from July 1999, showing the barn, or the red barn. This is December 3rd, 2019, approximately a week before the roof collapsed. And then this is the day after, so December 11th, 2019. Just a second photograph. As a part of the demolition request, the potential cultural heritage value or interest of the property is evaluated according to the criteria outlined in Ontario Regulation 906. So one additional thing I'd also like to note is in relation to condition. So condition is not a criteria for designation, nor for not designating. As a value-based evaluation process, cultural heritage resources can be found in deteriorated states, but can still maintain all or parts of their cultural heritage value or interest. So as it relates to the evaluations, staff did evaluate the property according to the criteria outlined in Ontario Regulation 906. And as it relates to physical and design value, the property was found to meet two of the criteria as a representative example of Queen Anne Revival style architecture, as well as it relates to the accessory building. The property was found to be a unique example of a timber frame structure. This includes its stylistic embellishments that elevates its appearance beyond just typical barn construction and conveys its additional former use as a carriage house as well as a warehouse. For its historical or associative value, it was found to meet two of the criteria as well, that being that the property is associated with William Griffith and the Griffith Brothers Woolen Mill, which operated between the 1860s and the 1890s, as well as its potential to yield further information related to the history of the Halls Mill area and its 19th century milling history. Lastly, for its contextual value, the property was found to meet all three of the criteria. So the property was found to be important in defining the character of the Halls Mill area. The property was found to be historically linked to Halls Mill Park across the street, being the site of the Griffith Brothers Mill. And lastly, the property, specifically the Red Barn, is known locally as a landmark. As a part of the demolition request, notices were sent to property owners within 120 meters of the property. There was also notice published in the Londoner, information on the city's website. The Architectural Conservancy of Ontario, the London region, London and Middlesex Historical Society and Urban League were contacted. Also, as mentioned previously in a previous item, the London Advisory Committee on Heritage were consulted at their January 8th meeting. Their meeting minutes can be found on the PAC agenda tonight. And they've also received a considerable amount of community input related to this property. So the staff recommendation is that notice be given of intent to designate the property at 247 Halls Mill Road to be of cultural heritage value for the reasons outlined in Appendix D of the staff report, which includes the statement of cultural heritage value. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Look to committee to see if there are any technical questions for Mr. Rego. Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. I do have a quick technical question. We're here tonight to give notice of intent to designate, if that's what the committee chooses to do. I understand that there is a order to make safe on the property right now, and I wonder if staff can comment on what does an order to make safe mean, and then what happens depending on what we do here tonight with the order to make safe.
Mr. Kokoros, is that you?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you, that is indeed correct. Our department issued an unsafe building order to make safe on December 13th, 2019. And basically, the remedial action that was required was either to repair and rebuild the roof and walls to support the roof in compliance with the 2012 Ontario Building Code, or demolish the building in its entirety. And to answer the councillor's question, what happens if the order is not complied with? The Building Code Act is very clear that in that case, the chief building official may order, prohibit use or occupancy of the structure or the building, and also may cause the building to be renovated, repaired, I'm just reading verbatim out of the Building Code Act, repaired or demolished to remove the unsafe condition or take such other action as he or she considers necessary for the protection of the public.
Thank you for that. And so when would that come about? If I know we're in the process right now to designate, but what's the time frame around the order to make safe?
Thank you, and once again, through you, Madam Chair. The actual order has a compliance date of January 9th, 2020, but seeing that we have been in communication with the owner and obviously pending the outcome of tonight's PEC meeting and essentially council's decision whether to designate or not, we would proceed accordingly with any action after following that.
Any other technical questions? No, I'm not seeing any, so I will go to the public. If you would like to comment on this item or ask questions, any questions, staff will take note of them, and at the end of the public portion of the meeting, staff will respond to any questions that have been raised throughout the public portion. So if you have a comment or a question, come to the mic, state your name. If you're comfortable, state your address, and you have 5 minutes. Go ahead.
My name is Jennifer Granger. I live at 956 Colburn Street. I'm president of ACO London. And as per the letter that we sent in, we would like to offer our support for the recommendation of the city's planning department and Latch that the property at 247 Halls Mills Road be designated under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act, and that the demolition request of the property owner be denied. Furthermore, we suggest that the city require the property owner to repair the barn to its pre-September 2019 condition as soon as possible, establish a firm deadline for the completion of the repair work, and take whatever action is permitted by law for the city to implement the required repairs at the property owner's expense. And if the property owner fails to do so by the established deadline, to make sure that this is done at his expense. I would also just like to address the Make Safe order. As a general rule, orders to make safe a heritage designated or heritage listed structure should not include the option to demolish, because that gives the property owner who is demolishing by neglect the exact outcome that he's seeking. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comments? We have 4 microphones, 2 at the top and 2 on the bottom. Just make your way to a mic, state your name, if you're comfortable, your address, and you will have 5 minutes.
Madam Chair and Committee, my name is Debbie Park, and I live at 1288 Halls Mill Place. Excuse me. I'd written up a large paper to present today and left it sitting at home. So I'm just going to try and cover a few of the things that I thought were most important. The barn itself is it's a magnificent piece of architecture. It's very important. In the book, London Street Names, just would like to point out on page, put my glasses on here, page 52, that they have an illustration of the barn. And this is representing the reason why Halls Mill was well known and how it came about to be called Halls Mill. And interestingly enough, they use the structure of the barn to represent this significant historical area. In the letter that was put in the London Free Press discussing the designation, the historical designation of, I think it was 12 different neighborhoods in the City of London, they used, again, 247 as their wonderful example of historical properties that should be designated. In this, the quote from the city is, "The report prepared by city staff sums up the potential opportunity for new heritage areas. Cultural heritage is an important community resource. It's a source of knowledge and memory. It contributes to the quality of life of a community. It is a collective legacy." This is our collective legacy, what is going on Halls Mill, and the barn is the centerpiece of that. You see it when you drive into Byron. It is at the very top of the hill, so it's the one thing out of all the homes that you do see. Being an owner of historical property myself, I understand the problems and the expense in maintaining historical properties. I would like to ask that perhaps the city go over their rules about, maybe, I know it was a provincial thing that happened a few years ago, but granting tax incentives, grants incentives to help people maintain their property, and perhaps we won't have quite as many purposeful neglects of historic properties. Also, if there's a way to follow up when the neighbors do mention that there's a problem with one of the historical properties, that there is a system set that they will follow up on the request and not leaving it up to neighbors, which is kind of an awkward position for us to be in, to report on damages being done to historical buildings. The wood is there. The main structure on the first floor is there. I would like to see the building rebuilt. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any other members of the public that would like to speak to this? Make your way to the microphone, ma'am. You all have 5 minutes.
I'm Nancy Towski. I live at 288 St. James Street, and I'm here in two capacities. One, as a member of the executive of the regional branch of the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario. I want to reinforce the letter that's on your agenda from our president, Jennifer Granger, and I want to support, like she does, the recommendation put forward by Latch and also the other recommendations that she notes there. I also want to speak briefly on in my own capacity. As you know from the Heritage Planners Report, I included this building in a book that I published back in the 1990s about London buildings. I accepted the contract from Broadview Press to do a second book on London buildings because my first book had concerned only the buildings by a particular architectural firm, and there were others I wanted to write about. But it turned out that I didn't have a very broad palette from which I was able to choose the buildings in the second book. I was supposed to only include 60 entries. I managed to eke it up to 66, but I had to fight for every last one. So any building that is in that book was there because I felt strongly about it as an experienced building analyst. I had several convictions about what I wanted the buildings in that book to represent. I didn't want it to be a survey of the 60 or 66 homes of London's richest citizens, or its most important institutional buildings. I wanted it to include institutional buildings, homes of the wealthy, buildings that were utilitarian, and buildings that were decorative. I wanted it to include things that were important for the poor as well as the rich. And when I began to look at all of those criteria, 66 buildings wasn't very many. I also felt very strongly, as I still do, that the buildings that represent the history of a small community, which later got eaten up into London, that those buildings are especially important as representing that small community. And here, a barn coach house that was built by one of the most important mill owners in what was originally Halls Mills certainly meets that criteria. So I urge you strongly to support its retention. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Toski. Anybody else like to speak to this? Any other members of the public? Yep, come ahead, come to the microphone. Oh, going back to Ms. Park, if you want to, I don't see her, there she is, email your remarks. You can email them to pec@london.ca, and the clerk will ensure that those get sent to all the members of council. Thank you. Go ahead, sir, if you state your name and if you're comfortable, your address, and you'll have 5 minutes.
My name is John McLeod. My wife and I are the owners of 247 Halls Mill. Okay, I'm a little confused at why I'm even here, because I thought this issue was over in 208. I saw up on the screen here where it was mentioned, it said it was subject to a demolition application, which I find a little misleading. I think it should have said that there was a demolition permit issued. I have a letter from the Planning Committee and from Don Menard, who was the Heritage Commissioner in 208. And he states, the inventory listing does not distinguish what structure or structures on the site are of heritage interest or value. There was a lot of discussion about this in meetings that I went to in 208 because it wasn't clear which building, the accessory building or the house. And then the recommendation was, given the difficulty of retaining a deteriorating structure which is of no value to the applicant, and the opportunity to designate the residential home. And this is what came out of that, this agreement was we would designate the home. And it said it is recommended that the demolition application for the removal of the coach house be approved. Now that's a letter from the Planning Committee. Yeah, and from Don Menard. Like I say, I'm a little bit confused about why I'm even here speaking to this. And I guess I have a question for the heritage planner. And that question is, do you intend to renege on what you've already agreed to? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And at the end of the public participation meeting, we'll get those answers. Is there any other member of the public who would like to speak to this item? Any other public comments or questions? Oh, come to the microphone, sir. State your name, your address if you're comfortable.
Yeah.
And
My name is Robert Dorr. I live at 78 Blackthorn Crescent. I'm also a business owner in Blackfriars, and I certainly appreciate heritage in our city, and I support keeping heritage buildings in our city. But when it was brought forward before that we should understand context, I think that we need to understand the context that this is a barn, and also that is a home for many rodents, and it is deteriorated for many, many, many years. And it's quite easy for other members of the public or for council to suggest restoring the barn to the grandeur of many years ago. But I would second the motion. If you want to enforce that type of law to have it restored, then I think you need to provide the funding to do that. When the barn and the property was purchased years ago, it was already in a very bad deteriorating state. There is no heritage designation on it at that point. And to fast forward to 2020 and to say it must now have a designation, it must now be restored. You know, I just think that that's easy to say, but if the city wants to have heritage properties, then they need to kind of put the money where the mouth is, and they need to provide some kind of funding for that. Once again, I'm a heritage advocate. I love heritage buildings, but this is not a residence that someone was living in. This is a barn that rodents were living in, and just we need to understand that context, and that's my input this evening.
Thank you, sir. Any other members of the public who would like to speak? Come to the microphones, state your name, go ahead.
Thanks. My name is Stephanie Radu, and I reside at 592 Pall Mall Street. I live nowhere near Byron, but as our previous speaker said, I too am an advocate for heritage in the city. I would just encourage for us all to think about the precedent that a building like this can set. So as to say, you know, these examples, singular examples, it's hard to just think of them as one-time incidences or individual architectural pieces, because the way that we treat them really dictates future treatments of our heritage sites and current understandings of how our councillors, how our citizens, and how our city overall treats heritage and values heritage. So I just wanted to put my voice in there to in support of the recommendations set forth by the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario and Latch, and to say that I think it's very important that individual examples of heritage structures like this and our treatment of them are understood, as we've been talking about a little bit with regards to context, within the broader context of how the city treats their heritage structures and discourages benign neglect.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? We've got 4 microphones.
Hi, my name is Brent McLeod. Here I've heard a lot of talk about a lot of feelings. And the thing with feelings is they don't mean anything. Facts mean everything. And the facts are, in 2008, a demolition permit was approved, and it was approved on the basis that the structure was unsound. Okay? And in the 12 years that have passed, the structure certainly has not improved. In fact, it's gotten much, much worse. That's an important fact to consider. Think here. Yeah, the other thing too, like this gentleman here mentioned too, about it being a house for rodents and raccoons and mice and skunks and you name it's in there. It's also now an eyesore. Okay, it's fallen in on itself, and it is now as of zero use to the owner whatsoever, and not a penny will be going into it, and I don't see where it would go from there. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Any other members of the public? Come to the microphone, sir.
My name is Mylan Hall. I tried to save 211 Halls Mill Road, which is at the bottom of the T block in the village of Westminster, which was really, I mean, if you didn't save that building, it was the Commission Magistrates building. It was the principal property of the Cyrenius Hall enterprise from 1833 on. And it was the distillery house as well. I mean, what city tears down their distillery house? I spent over 3,000 hours trying to save that building. I did about 800 hours before the first draft went to the Latch. They didn't do a thing with it, and George Goodlett, the chair, basically was going to submit the draft. They hadn't worked on it at all. So as far as I'm concerned, the most important thing about 211 or any of the Halls Mill properties is that you recognize the top of the street where the Mill Creek flowed that ran the mill, and that should be designated because it's the first property that the city bought in relationship to the pump house and changing the waterborne illness that plagued this city for 30 years, even though we had a railway and we had a termination highway from the Lakehead at Lake Erie. We had Dundas Street terminating at, and we had the railway. Like, I mean, these sort of things make a city bloom. It wasn't until the Springbank water changed everything in 1878, and then the city exploded. Some things about Halls Mill are very important, but the importance is gone. What you need to do is we need to build cairns, and we need to describe what the stream-fed system meant to the first pioneers and the industrialists, as well as what the riverfront in 1833 operation added to that system, sustaining the garrison. That's your context. If you don't go with that, it's just a bunch of buildings on an old street that are aging. I would say that the block busting thing happened 17 years ago, and that's what you're fighting right now. And I think that whoever jacked a hole through 211 Halls Mill Road, and then the city who had their people stabilize the building, let it go into a dilapsed state because they didn't make it waterproof. So, you know, I've pretty much spent a lot of time trying to do the right thing to get some theme orientation to change the Ontario Curriculum Development Program concerning what the Canada West movement actually meant here outside of the city limits of London at one time. And so I'll close by saying I think we need a cairn at the bottom of the street where 211 Halls Mill Road, describing what happened there. And I think we need a cairn at the top, preserving that last piece of glacial topography and land untouched. It's one of the most important things is to preserve the T block and at least demark it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hall. Anybody else? Make your way to the microphone carefully, and then you'll have your 5 minutes.
Hi, my name's Jeff Sand. This won't take 5 minutes. I guess I have to start with a question first. Unless I misread it, was not the demolition permit revoked a year later? That's a question that I thought I understood, but maybe I didn't. And I guess secondly, long time just down the road from this property, lived there. I was never inside, I admit that, but it seemed to be standing structurally reasonable until a deliberate act to start pulling it apart happened. And then, after an order to stop, you continue? You grant this demolition, he gets what he wants, he's going to apply for severance so that he can sell land. That was the whole plan when he did it way back when. And having said that, I like analogies. What Eldon House is to downtown London is what this place is, actually the whole street, is to Byron. Really think about that, because if you let them take it down, the application for severances will be in no time. Thank you.
Okay, and I just want to remind people to not make assumptions on what anybody's motives are or anything. We're just here to talk about this application for a demolition permit. Is there anybody else who would like to speak to this? One more time. Any other member of the public who would like to speak to this issue? And I'm not seeing any, so I will ask the committee for a motion to close the public participation meeting, moved by Councillor Kayabaga, seconded by Councillor Hopkins, and we will vote on that on screen.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
So I'm aware of a couple of questions. There were a number of questions from the property owner, which I'm sure staff took note of. So if you miss anything, I'll just remind you. And also the question about whether or not the demolition permit was revoked.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you, if I could start with the revocation of the demolition permit. I do confirm that the demolition permit that was issued on August 1st, 2008 was indeed revoked December 4th, 2009.
Okay, and so I know the property owner was asking specifically about the demolition permit and in reference to the staff report from 2008 when the home was recommended to be designated but not the barn. Just wondering if there's any staff response to any of those comments.
Through the chair, in fact, the demolition permit, when it was put in 2008, was recommended for approval. As was also noted, Latch did not agree with that. But what I can advise the committee is that at that time, and I think Mr. McLeod referred to it, the issue was more around the house than it was around the barn. And there was the notion, that never followed up, that the home would be designated, and that didn't occur. I could also, though, add, which I think is even more important, is that at that time, there was no Section 906 evaluation that was done on the property. So the evaluation that Mr. Grigwell took you through today was never done on the property when that original recommendation was made. And so in all fairness, the barn was likely, as part of that, not fully evaluated, but it certainly did not go through its full Section 906 evaluation that would have identified those heritage characteristics that were noted by Mr. Grigwell in his presentation this evening.
Thank you. Committee, questions, comments? Councillor Hopkins.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for all the comments this evening. I do have a couple questions, just following up on from the gallery. I know there was a question from ACO about in order to make safe, and part of in order to make safe, the question was, part of that is to request to demolish. And I'm just wondering if we could, if that is at all a possibility to remove that request to demolish out of an order to make safe. I know there's 3 parts to the order to make safe, but just if you could touch upon that one.
Through you, Madam Chair, the building division would never suggest a demolition in terms of a form to comply with an unsafe order. It is a remedy available to the owner. It's part of our standard template that we use for unsafe orders. And further to that, the demolition would obviously require a demolition permit. Applicable law is the Heritage Act. In other words, the chief building official would not be issuing a demolition permit until the Heritage Act was complied with.
Thank you. And 2 quick questions, again, from the gallery about what do we do when a structure is unsafe? Is there a procedure that we follow? I know, for instance, my roof was falling down and I got an engineering and a structural report done to make sure whatever I did to keep my roof staying up would be structurally sound. Doesn't look pretty, but I know it's structurally sound. And the second question is about tax incentives. I know, have we looked at tax incentives at all for heritage properties?
Thank you. And once again, through you, Madam Chair, as far as the procedure and what happens after an unsafe order is issued, the Building Code Act under 1596B is clear and gives the chief building official various things that he or she can do. So one is, again, to prohibit the use or occupancy of the building and also proceed with repairing or even demolishing the building or any other steps that he feels necessary to protect the public. So one of those steps could be, for example, erecting a metal fence around the structure, prohibiting access to the building, and therefore the building is no longer deemed unsafe. As far as the next question, sorry, I'm going to have to defer over to Mr. Barrett.
And just before staff proceeds. I know there are some tax incentives out there, but is there anything that, a lot of our tax incentives tend to be in heritage districts, or in this situation, or in just a property that's designated, what are the opportunities for the owner to get incentives without having the other attachments to it?
Through the chair, as the councillors noted, the heritage tax grants are components of some of the city's existing incentive programs. There is also a specific heritage tax incentive program, but it's more tied to the redevelopment, where with the preservation of the heritage asset, there are certain grants that are provided for as a result of redevelopment on a site. There were, and there still is, a program that exists through the London Endowment for Heritage, and that was a small-scale program that went to individual property owners. The city did not administer that program. It was not the city's program. It was through the London Endowment for Heritage. The city was part of the review process for eligible projects, and it wasn't so much a tax grant program as it was a grant for works that were done. So for example, the grant had paid for chimney repointing, masonry repairs, window replacements, those kinds of things for private property owners. That program, I don't believe has issued grants in a number of years because it was funded through the interest on the endowment. But as a city program, none specific to this instance, but we do have tax grants associated with heritage and part of our larger incentive programs.
Anyone else on committee? Councillor Kayabaga, sorry, and then Deputy Mayor Helmer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, and I'd like to thank staff for this report. I just had a question on, in the section of the demolition request. In 2009, it says that the demolition permit was revoked due to non-action. Can we get some context on that? Like, was it because they were required to demolish the building and then took no action to demolish the building, or what does that really mean?
Through you, Madam Chair, I don't have the actual correspondence back from 2009, but we typically do inform the permit holder of our intent to revoke a building permit, or in this case, a demolition permit. And actually from the Building Code Act, the chief building official is in a position to revoke a permit if after 6 months after its issuance, construction or demolition has not been commenced, seriously commenced is what the actual word the Building Code Act uses. And in that case, the building or demolition permit would be revoked.
Thank you. And just through you, Madam Chair, I'm curious to know whether there was any actions taken by the owner from 2009 to date to try and keep the barn together, or was it just left vacant and empty and to continue to fall apart? Since from the report, or my impressions are that when the owner purchased the property, it was already in somewhat of bad conditions, and I'm curious to know whether once the permit to demolish was revoked, what were the actions that were taken to keep this specific property together?
Thank you. And once again, through you, Madam Chair, with the limited information that I have at this time, we have checked our records since that revocation took place, and there has been no complaint entered into the system or any other unsafe order issued on this structure. So at that time, I presume a site inspection was conducted, the building was still up, it wasn't demolished, and we chose to revoke the permit because no activity actually took place.
Thank you. So my last question would be, and so currently this specific building is not designated as heritage, and we're trying to designate it. So I'm just wondering, how are the tax breaks for heritage properties are going to apply? And just so I don't keep talking too much, to add some final comments on that, I think that I support the motion on the table here that staff are bringing forward. I'm a strong advocate for heritage. I see the great need from the public to make this a heritage building, but I feel like there's, on our part, some work that we need to do in terms of what I continue to talk about when we mention, heritage buildings. This is our job, that we have to have a system in place so we don't have to make these reactory actions all the time, which is why I pulled or I continue to ask that we bring in reports to constantly do our part in keeping some of these important sites in our city to be active and not to be proactive and not be reactive is my final comments on this. I think I didn't know I was gonna have to keep having this conversation when I was joining PEC, but PEC is the place to have these conversations, which is probably why I got excited to be here. But I feel like I'm gonna keep saying this over and over again. It's our responsibility as a city to keep track of important sites in our community so that we don't have to get to a place like this where a demolition permit is provided and then revoked, and then we have to go through this process again. This should have been designated a long time ago during the time where the permit was revoked, and we should have been able to keep track of what's happening with this site so that we can continue to protect the remains of it. So I will support staff's report, but I would like to know how the owner of the property will be able to advantage from some sort of incentive or tax system through the heritage program as they continue, or as they may have to or will have to, if this pass at committee and at council, to upkeep this building. Thank you.
Again, through the chair, the incentive programs that the city has, as well as the London Endowment for Heritage, are to designated properties. So step one would be to, in fact, designate this property. As I said, with respect to the city's two programs, one's a DC grant program where it's equivalent to the development charges that would be accrued to the property. And in this instance, again, I'm not too sure that development charges would even apply. It's an accessory structure. And then the second program is a tax grant program that takes care of the increased value of assessment as a result of a redevelopment of a property. And again, I'm not too sure that even the rehabilitation and the renewal of this building back to its existing condition is something that would result in a reassessment that would provide for any advantage under this program. And I do want to clarify, I did misspeak on the Endowment for Heritage grants. It's my understanding, in fact, that we have been making some small grants under this program. But again, there are two individual property owners for designated properties. This property, once designated, could avail of that. But I do know that the amount of money that's been going out on that has been relatively small because it's funded through the interest on the endowment.
Deputy Mayor Helmer.
Thank you. There was a issue raised around how to commemorate the sort of broader contextual history by someone in the delegations from the public. And I wonder, I know that the Heritage District's work is sort of being prioritized, and whether that kind of broader recognition of the contextual value, putting cairns either at the top or the bottom or some combination of those things, if that's something that's going to be considered when we look at it as a potential heritage district, separate from the specific issue that's in front of us in terms of this particular property.
Through the chair, certainly through the development of a Heritage Conservation District, studying the Heritage Conservation District plan, this is something that could be looked at as to how do you represent the heritage that exists and how do you tell the story of the site. The use of cairns or the use of some type of demarcation to show the old water course is something that certainly could be looked at as part of that plan.
Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just going to make some comments right now, and I, again, want to thank the public for coming out. I am hoping that my colleagues will support the request to designate the Red Barn or the auxiliary accessory building as it's known. And one of the things, I really appreciate the conversation about what happened back in 2008, 2009. And from that conversation that we just had here, what I got out was that the barn was not even evaluated at that time. And we are here talking about the designation and the work that's gone into recommending that it be designated. So with that, I just want to also make a comment that the exterior of this barn was made out of chestnut wood, and I understand chestnut wood is pretty strong. It's pretty structurally sound. It says in the report that despite the changes, this is still a significant building. So I would really hesitate why we would not designate this building as a matter of just the fact that it's a landmark in Hulls Mills. This is where Byron started. And it's important to the City of London. It's our history as well, not just to Byron. So I really would encourage the support. I would like to make an amendment to this motion by adding a two parts to the motion, a C and a D. And before I go on with that motion, I think it's clear that all of us here understand that we could be doing a better job designating, treating our heritage properties. I think it's difficult, it's challenging, a lot of, we're kind of sort of constrained as a municipality on what we can and can't do, but I know we can do a better job when it comes to protecting heritage, especially discouraging neglect of our heritage buildings. I think that really needs to be emphasized. And the fact that we could be doing a better job, being proactive. I find sometimes sitting here at the committee, we're always reacting, and sometimes it's at the last minute, the last time. And I think it's important that we try to look at things in a better way. And so with that, I would like to add a C and a D to the A and B, which is to designate this property. And that is to have administration be directed to evaluate properties located in Hulls Mills for possible designation under Part 5 of the Ontario Heritage Act. And D, to also direct staff to undertake an evaluation of its barns within the city for possible designation under Part 5. And with that, I understand there is a process. It goes to Latch. Latch does all the work, and then it eventually comes back. But this red barn is more than a red barn. It is Hulls Mills. It's the cultural heritage of Byron. And I visit a friend of mine, and he has in his front hall a picture of this red barn. And I know to some, maybe pictures are great. We've got pictures, and we can put plaques up, and we can do this and we can do that. But if we already have this barn, why aren't we trying to protect it? I'm still not over the Cedars, which was across the road. That went up fire about a year and a half ago. But we're losing these buildings, and we can do a better job. The designation part, I think, is part of a community conversation. Latch will be looking at it. There are a number, there could be up to 5, not to say that they're all worthy of designation on the heritage inventory list, but they should be looked at and should be looked at the potential for designation. Barns in the City of London, there are a number of barns. And again, we already had a debate here a couple years ago with the barn over at Sunningdale and Adelaide. We were able to keep that barn going, and now I would hope it's a focal point of that subdivision. So, Madam Chair, I will submit the 2 clauses to C and D as an amendment to the motion, and I'm hoping that this committee will support.
Any other comments or questions? There's a motion that's been moved. Do you have a seconder, Councillor? Is there a seconder on the committee? Councillor Kayabaga? Okay, ask a question. sorry, Mr. Barrett. I thought maybe I should look to staff and see what staff
So-
has to say. Go
so
ahead.
Sorry, just very quickly, just for some clarification, because Councillor mentioned Part 5, written as Part 4, and might I suggest to you that it is Part 4 of the Act that you would be asking us to look at, and that is individual designation, just so that folks understand. So you're asking us to look at the potential for individual designation for properties along Halls Mills Road, as well as to look at the possibility of individual designation of barns. So it's, I just want to clarify Part 4, and that is what the resolution says.
Great. And to committee members, the motion is on your screen as well, if you wanted to take a peek at that. Councillor Van Holst, welcome to our committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to acknowledge the dilemma that was posed here, and that's of course the difference. We talk about our heritage properties when, you know, in fact, it may be that your heritage property or the person there, and we want to somehow save these things, and I think we certainly need to come up with some help to do that. It'd be a lot to ask somebody to completely restore this building and do what we really want is you paint it and then make a little tea room out of it that people can visit, and you make your own jams and like this, the wonderful things that you see in other places. But that's very costly, and I believe that we need a new way to look at dealing with heritage preservation. We need to come up with a fund and put resources in that in order that we can assist in these areas.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other comments from committee? Councillor Keybog, are you seconding the motion? Yes? Seconded by Councillor Keybog. So I just have a few questions for staff, since nobody else on committee has, so far, right now, has any questions. I'm just trying to get a grip also on the timeline of everything that's taken place on this property. So just to be clear, when the demolition permit was issued in 2008, that was for the house and not the barn? That was, okay, Mr. Barrett, clarify that for me, please.
So it was for the barn. What I indicated, though, was that when that was done, and also I think it's really important to note, it was actually my name on that report back in 2008. So I just want everybody to know that. I was wearing the hat back then in Heritage, so I just want everybody to understand that. But in 2008, it was for the barn, the accessory structure. What I did say was in that, when that was done, first of all, it was many years ago, but an evaluation of the barn was not undertaken. Most of the conversation, and from the information we can find in the files, most of the conversation was around the house. But yes, the request was to demolish the barn. Most of the conversation was about the importance of the house. And staff did recommend the demolition of the barn, but as I noted, and as was noted earlier, Latch did not agree with that recommendation back in 2008. But yes, we did recommend the demolition of the barn, but we did not do an evaluation, a 906 evaluation like what was done as part of your report this evening.
And to you again, Mr. Barrett, when was this property, and when we add a property to the listing, it's the address. So I understand it's every building at that address. So when was it added to the listing?
Through the chair, this was, the register was readopted as the register in 2007, so this was on the register because this was originally on the inventory. So it was added to the register in 2007 when council adopted what was called the inventory as the register. It's my understanding it was on the inventory back in the 1990s, 1991, 1992.
Okay, very good. I'm wondering, probably to Mr. Kokoros, when the cladding on the roof was started to be removed, did that add to the collapse or speed, or cause the collapse, or speed up the collapse, or and you may not have the answer to that. I'm wondering if you do.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We don't have sufficient detail to ascertain and confirm that the removal of the roof cladding indeed led to the collapse of the roof structure.
Thank you for that. Those were my questions, committee. I just needed some more clarity on some of those issues. I'm wondering if there's any more comments from committee. No. Oh, no, just adjusting of glasses. So Councillor Hopkins referenced some barns on Sunningdale Road. That's in Ward 5. That is my ward. First of all, thank you to all members of the public for coming out, and thank you to the property owners for coming out. And my apologies for not acknowledging you earlier in the meeting. Generally, that is what I do. I go to the applicant first, but thank you for speaking. The barns on Sunningdale Road, there were actually 3 barns, and we are left with 2. It was a similar situation in that perhaps some ignorance about what the rules are around barn and agricultural buildings. Part of the roof of one of the buildings started to be dismantled. And so, and that was the biggest barn on the property. It stood on a hill. When you were in the North London area, especially on Sunningdale or Adelaide, you could see that barn from many directions. And so the community did notice when the barn started to become dismantled and made city staff aware that that was taking place. So unfortunately, we did designate 2 of the barns that had not been touched, but the largest barn, the most iconic part probably, we weren't able to save, and City Council did not designate that barn. But we did save the 2, and they are being incorporated into a large subdivision development that's currently being built as we speak. I hear the concerns from property owners about the cost and the challenges of maintaining these heritage structures, but the fact of the matter is this house has been, or these properties have been on the registry for a very long time, and there are responsibilities that come with owning buildings that are on this registry. I hope the property owner will investigate further if this does pass, if these buildings are designated. I hope there will be further investigation into possible incentives and grants through the London Endowment for Heritage that may help with rehabilitating these structures. I certainly invite the property owners to reach out to the heritage experts that are in our community that could offer them some help or assistance and advice on how to maintain these properties. So those are my comments. We have a motion on the floor. If there are no further comments or questions, then I think we can call the question.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
Thank you again to everybody who participated in that public participation meeting. We will move along to item number 3.4, which is another public participation meeting for an application at 435 Callaway Road, formerly 365 Callaway Road. I will look to committee for a motion to open the public participation meeting, moved by Councillor Keabaga, seconded by Councillor Hopkins, and we will vote on that.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
So we have some changing of the guard in the gallery. I'm wondering if there are members of the public that are here for this item, the 435 Callaway Road application. Is there anybody from the public that is here to hear about this item or comment on this item? I'm not seeing anybody. So I'll look to committee to see if you require a formal presentation about this application. I see heads shaking. So just a brief introduction about what we're about to talk about.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So this is a public participation meeting to introduce a proposed draft vacant land condo and a concurrent site plan for the purposes of reporting any issues to the approval authority. This site is at 435 Callaway Road. It's part of the Sunning-Leah subdivision. This was a subdivision that received draft approval about 2 years ago, and the zoning for this site was established at that time. This block within that subdivision is located at the northwest corner of Callaway Road and Meadowlands Road. It is within the neighborhood place type, zoned or designated multifamily medium density in the 89 official plan, and zoned residential R5 and R6 zone, which permits cluster forms of townhomes units in cluster and stacked form. The draft vacant land condo is also being considered concurrent with a site plan. It includes a total of 94 townhouse units in a form of a cluster form, 3 stories in height, 1 access from Callaway Road, which is at the extreme west end of Callaway Road. All driveways to the units will all be accessed internally through a private road, and ultimately this will result in 1 condo registration. This is a copy of the landscape plan that's been submitted as part of the site plan. You can see that all the driveways to each individual units are being accessed internally. Orientation of the units is, there's special treatment that is orienting the front doors, the main entrances to all the abutting public roads, that being Sunningdale Road West, Meadowland Way, and Callaway Road. And also, this ensures that no noise walls will be needed as part of this development. This is a copy of the elevations that have been included, which show a 3-story form. The garages are all in line with the buildings, with only the front porch being projecting in front of the garage. The zoning, again, it permits the cluster form of townhomes. Now, the zoning does cap the development at 35 units per hectare. The development is, the developer here is proposing 36 units per hectare, so that will be the subject of a future minor variance application. The maximum height is 13 meters, and that's been adhered to with the submitted plans. I believe that's about it. We did receive 1 comment from a member of the public who did raise some concerns about density, had some questions about landscaping, and I believe most of those matters have been dealt with. So what we're asking here today is that PEC report any issues from the public participation meeting to the approval authority related to both the draft vacant land condo and the site plan.
Thanks very much, Mr. Pompili. Any technical questions from committee? I'm seeing none. Is the applicant here?
This on? Jay McGuffin, Monteith Brown Planning Consultants. We've gone through the planning report and are supportive of the recommendations of the planning department. And again, we're here on behalf of both the former owner and the new owner. So that would have been Corlawn Properties, Inc., now Wasdell Homes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any members of the public here who would like to comment on this or ask questions? Any members of the public who are perhaps being shy? I'm not seeing any. So I'll look to committee to close the public participation meeting. Moved by Councillor Keabaga, seconded by Councillor Hopkins, and we'll vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
Great. Any discussion from committee? I'm not seeing any. Is there a motion? Staff recommendation, perhaps? Moved by Deputy Mayor Helmer, seconded by Councillor Hopkins. And if there is no discussion, then we will vote on that.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
Wonderful. That brings us to our next public participation meeting, the Affordable Housing Community Improvement Plan. I need a motion to open that PPM. Moved by Councillor Hopkins, seconded by Deputy Mayor Helmer. We'll vote on that.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
And we will receive a staff presentation on this topic. If you want to go right ahead, Mr. Macbeth.
Thank you. Through the chair. Just as a brief background, community improvement planning is part of Section 28 of the Planning Act, and it's for the planning, design, redevelopment, or development of sites, or for any social or community economic development reasons, including affordable housing. And the Planning Act definition of community improvement aligns with the Affordable Housing Community Improvement Plan. It's explicitly one of the reasons for community improvement is affordable housing. But in order to adopt a community improvement plan, you have to designate a project area at the end of a study. So identifying what part of the city, or if it's the entire city, that they would require this. And then following that, the city can take actions or encourage actions of landowners, including some things that otherwise aren't permitted through the Planning Act and other legislation, including things like incentives. So you may have heard some of this fairly recently, and that's because the draft CIP was brought here in November of 2018 with the direction to bring back the final in January in order to tie the timing of this coordinated with the multi-year budget process that is ongoing. So the Affordable Housing CIP is intended to implement the London Plan and the Housing Stability Action Plan. Those are the broader frameworks for it. And this is also one of a range of tools that the city uses as part of a toolkit to help encourage the creation of affordable housing and address the affordable housing need. And the CIP is also an initiative within the toolkit which would be recognized as the city's contribution to co-investment, which is required for access to federal co-investment funding. The programs identified are also aligned with other city building initiatives, and again, it allows the city to take actions that are not otherwise permitted. So just as a brief reminder, affordable housing is the one highlighted in red, but the toolkit is a range of existing practices as well as new initiatives that the city will be working towards. And there's ongoing consultation with the development community and nonprofits about the range of tools that should be in this toolkit. But again, because of co-investment, this one was brought forward as a priority. So what is the update then from 2019? Community meetings were held in December 2019, as well as taking in public comments. Generally, there was public support for CIP initiatives, the objectives, monitoring measures, and then it applying across the entire city. And the comments in those public meetings generally centered on financial incentive programs rather than the CIP itself. So some of that was actually on the guidelines, and some of it was on how much money is there going to be in these incentive programs. And of course, that is something that has to be determined by council through the multi-year budget process, and with each new budget can assign more or less funding to it, or based on ongoing monitoring of CIP once in place, you can amend or adjust your programs or delete programs or add new programs. Some of the questions were around, just as sort of brief background, what's actually being recommended based on that ongoing consultation and feedback is designation of the Affordable Housing Community Improvement Project area, amendments to Map 8 of the London Plan, which would include the Affordable Housing Community Improvement Project area, adoption of the Affordable Housing CIP for that project area, and adoption of program guidelines. So the map on the left is the project area, and in black is the municipal boundaries. It would apply citywide. The urban growth boundaries identified because some of the programs make reference to it, but the program guidelines themselves have more detail. They can relate to land uses or criteria or that sort of thing. And then map 8 in the London Plan, and that section of the plan is in effect, but there's a reference to CIPs that apply citywide, so it would be, the reference to it would be added. The actual program guidelines changes since November. There are a couple. There's two different programs. The first is a multi-unit program. That one, average market rent before had been identified as a citywide average market rent. It's recommended that the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation's rental market zones in their annual reports be applied, except if the data is older than a year old, then the city would have the option to use citywide data. And then the repayment of the loan by applicants, it previously was recommended that it start when buildings were constructed and go for equal installments for 10 years. Based on discussions with the Housing Development Corporation and the developing community and the public, it was identified that 3 installment payments at milestone dates was more appropriate. The other changes to the second one is additional residential unit program. Now the province is now referring to secondary dwelling units as additional residential units, so that term has changed throughout. That's also to recognize because it used to be one in the main building or in a converted garage, and now it could be one in both, so they are additional units. But in addition to the terminology, it's also recommended that that program only apply to existing residences, not to new construction in new subdivisions, for instance. Servicing would also be an eligible work because you would have to connect if it were in a garage, for instance, to municipal services, and then also applying citywide. Previously, it was identified as within the urban growth boundary, but in recognition of rural neighborhoods as well. Again, just briefly in conclusion, it's recommended designation of the project area being citywide. Program guidelines have a bit more detail. Amendments to Map A to the London Plan, adoption of the CIP, and adoption of the incentive programs. And then as a next step, program funding would be evaluated as part of the multi-year budget. Budget deliberations being January 30th for this matter, and then subject to that evaluation, loan agreements could be entered into after the budget is established. And I would also just want to point out, as a reminder, the amendments are consistent with the PPS, conform with the London Plan, and are consistent with definitions of community improvement in the Planning Act. Happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Any technical questions from committee? Deputy Mayor Helmer.
Thank you. So, as someone who suggested using the average market rent for the zones, or something like that, I'm interested in that as an idea. Have you taken a look to see how that maps onto the reality of what is the sort of affordable housing situation in those zones? Well, one of the concerns I have is that it's probably a very convenient thing to use because it's measured and we don't have to like recreate it and we don't have to create a new geography, and that makes a lot of sense for those reasons. But if you, for example, you had a very small proportion of a big area where the average rent was quite high, but in this one corner, you know, there's a really serious affordability problem and it's just kind of being lost in the average, that would be a very unfortunate kind of drawing of the lines. So I just want to check to see whether we looked at that to see if there's anything that's obviously going to be problematic where the overall average for the area is way out from some outlier that we know is like a lot of units or a place where we expect a lot of intensification or anything like that, because it does seem to me like that this approach could be a little bit vulnerable to that kind of problem. Not that I want to change it. I actually think we should just go ahead with it the way it is, just to be clear, and see how it goes. But I did want to ask about it.
Yeah, through the chair, that's certainly something we can take a look at and make sure we monitor. One thing that we did include in this, if I can sort of answer this in a backhanded way, is we did include that there's a big notion of monitoring, so we can assess the impacts of this program, of these programs, and make sure that they are doing what we want them to do. This was where we landed because one of the comments we were hearing through the feedback was that the use of a citywide may in fact do exactly what the councillor is saying, is that might not fully account for some of the anomalies that exist within the City of London market. This, as again the councillor noted, this was easy because it's data that are collected and they are geographic zones that have had some level of consistency. We didn't really notice any outliers, but I think that one of the issues, and we speak to it in the report, is that there's a difference between the average market rent and then the asking market rent. And so all these different kinds of anomalies, because there's the average market rent captures what people are paying now who are in units, as well as what then might pop onto the market. And there's already a disconnect between that. And so one AMR of average versus the other AMR, which is asking, already is a little bit of an anomaly, and that's something that we've tried to recognize, and that's one of the things that we're going to be looking at to try to see if we can come up and have a better answer when asked this question: are we truly reflecting what in fact the levels of affordability are in the different parts of the city?
Any other technical? Councillor Hawkins.
Yeah, I do have a technical question about the, I guess the monitoring. I heard from staff right now, it's going to take a bit of resources, and I know this will be going through the budget process, depending on what happens here tonight, but what about staffing, and how will the monitoring look like? And if you can just talk a little bit more about the staff resources.
To the chair, there is a business case ask for staff support on the CIP programs in general. One staff person in planning, one in finance, because all of our incentive programs are actually taking off. They are requiring a lot of work. With respect to the specifics of the monitoring, I would refer you to page 259, where we speak to the monitoring of your agenda, where we actually lay out those kinds of things we're looking at. And these are the kinds of things, again, where we hopefully should readily be able to get those data so that we can report out to you on how these programs are working. But yes, there is a separate budget ask for additional staff support for all of the CIP programs in general.
Any other technical questions? I see none. Any, Deputy Mayor? Okay. Any member of the public who would like to speak to this? Okay, I'm seeing hands. We got 2 microphones, one up top, one below. Who's first? Oh, we got 3 hands. Okay, if you want to state your name, and we know your name, but go ahead.
Gary Brown, 59 Rideout, Apartment 35A. I am a big fan of community improvement projects. Traditionally, they come out of what was initially probably called PACE projects. I really just have a technical question about this. I'm supportive. Was there any consideration to making the repayment process through the property taxes? That way, the repayment is on the onus of the property owner of the time. So it means if you sold the house, you're not responsible for the loan. The new property owner would be. Generally, this is a capital project, right? It's generally just to lower that hump a little bit, to bring an incentive on, right? We have to get all the way up here, raise all this money to make a property improvement. And the idea is kind of just to put a little money in and bring that hump down a little bit. So hopefully it incentivizes it. It was really just my question. Did we consider having it attached to the property taxes? I don't even know if it's legal, to be honest with you, anymore. And that way, if somebody was to sell their house, I mean, if you have a granny flat and you say you've taken advantage of this loan program to build the granny flat, cost you $20,000, whatever, you're going to have an income from that granny flat. And as long as the cost is lower than the income from that granny flat, you're in a cash positive situation. Therefore, if you sell the house, you're still selling a cash positive situation and taking advantage of this loan, but the loan is passed on to the property owner of the time. So we're tagging it to the builder or whoever actually does the project. Have we looked into the possibility of tagging it to the property itself? City gets paid either way. It's quite low risk, especially if it's on the property taxes. It's just a question of interest when I heard about this program.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Anybody else? We'll get that answer after the PPM closes, okay? State your name, and if you're comfortable, your address, and you'll have 5 minutes.
Darlene Bellarose, 462 Gray Street. So I have a few comments, not questions. I just wanted to say that while I'm in principle agree with this program, and I think that it may provide some additional affordable housing, I think that the biggest issue is that while this may create affordable within the definition of affordable, It is still not going to address the larger need of housing that's needed. Affordability under this program will not make housing reachable for anyone that's making less than $39,000 a year. So people on Ontario Works, ODSP, OAS, working minimum wage, will not be able to afford any of these wonderful new units that are being made. This has been pointed out, I'm sure it's no surprise to you. So that's my first comment, is that we're still not addressing the greatest core need. We're still not addressing those people who ultimately and possibly could end up being those people that are living in hotels and on the street. The other thing is that I've seen this, I'm an old boot. I've been around a long, long time. And my big concern about any of these programs is how much money is being taken out of the pot that could help create housing to pay for the bureaucracy. So again, I just plead with you, please, 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 do not take necessary money out of the pot that would actually build housing to create a whole bunch of high-paid jobs and consultants and whatever else you're going to spend the money on. We've seen it time again. Quite honestly, I've been here in London now for over 45 years. I've been harping on affordable housing for probably 45 years. And I've seen this thing come and go. We still have London Middlesex housing, still has units that are inhabitable. Every year, year after year after year, councils talk the talk, but when it comes time to put the money in, again, you folks chop the budget. You chop the axe. So I'm just asking, please try to preserve as much money as you can to put it into affordable housing, and I mean affordable housing for people who are not making 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 and up $1,000 a year. There's a whole bunch of us in this city who aren't making that kind of money. And there's a whole bunch of us in this city who contribute to this city, but we can't afford most of your affordability incentives. And I guess I'm just going to point out to whoever line 302 in your agenda here from a Mr. Chris Butler. I don't know the fella, but he sent a letter to you folks. I'm going to say, yeah, please read that and take it to heart. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Mr. Wallace, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, councillors. And my name is Mike Wallace. I'm with the London Development Institute, and we are at 562 Wellington Street, just up the road from you. So I sent you a letter individually. I didn't make it in time to make the agenda item, so it's not attached to the agenda, and it highlights LDI's position on the CIP that's being presented this evening, and we are certainly in favor. We're certainly in favor. And I want to, first of all, thank Travis for his work on the public consultation that he underwent, him and his team, in terms of getting feedback from not just us, but from a number of areas. And we really appreciate the opportunity to comment and actually get involved in a real discussion about what will work and what doesn't. And I will talk about the two programs very briefly. I'll start with the second program. The one program about an additional unit within your home, whether it's a separate building or within your home, it doesn't really affect us. You have to live there. And so for the group that I'm representing, we develop and build units and sell them, and they don't live there. So for my group, that is not directly involved, but we are very supportive of the program because it gives an opportunity for those who are trying to get into the market that maybe a second unit with that income that comes from here. They might be able to get into it that they wouldn't be before. It may allow a senior to stay in their home that through other issues, financial issues or whatever the issues that they may have some difficulty doing that. So seniors, home ownership possibilities, and of course, creating housing that hopefully will be at a more affordable level for those who are looking for their first opportunity to get someplace to live. So we're very much in favor of it. We hope it has, as Deputy Mayor said, we hope it has take up by the public, and monitoring will be important to see how it goes. The second piece, which I think was really designed for those who are going to build multi-unit residential facilities, is a loan program that, you know, we have to be frank with the group that I represent, that we're at like 15 of the largest home builders, developers in the city. That incentive that's there may not be of that much of an interest to the group that I represent, but it doesn't mean that there aren't smaller developers that it might really have an important effect on. So we are very supportive of it being there. We'd like to see how it's monitored. And look, I just can't comment on whether my group, any of my people would pick it up and run with it and see what would happen. But I do have to agree with the previous speaker that my experience is that whatever you do, you need to make the program very simple to apply for, simple to be approved, and make it happen quickly, because time is money for all these things. And if in my previous hat that I had on, when someone came to see me about a government program, I said, well, sure, the money is there, you can apply, we'd be happy to help you, but you have to be prepared to take the time and the effort to make it happen. And that's at a completely different level than at the municipal level. At the municipal level, you have a real opportunity to make these things happen quickly and get them in place so you can actually see results on the streets early. So that's my recommendation. It is only one part of the toolkit that we're working on, and I just want to let you know that from LDI's perspective, there are other things in the toolkit that we think that we can have that we can help with, that we can make suggestions on to really make a difference. I know we're just starting next week on the rethink zoning sort of process. I think there's some real opportunities in the rethink zoning process that, in terms of affordability and our group being involved, have a real opportunity there. So we congratulate staff on the work on this, on you guys' commitment to the affordability issues here in London. And from LDI's perspective, we're happy to help and be partners on making things happen. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Wallace. Any other comments from the public? Mr. Justicia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Steve Justicia from the Housing Development Corporation, 520 Wellington, between City Hall and LDI, figuratively and in other ways, and concur with a lot of what's been said already, starting with the thanks to the great work the planning did, Travis and Greg and the teams, primarily around, and not with an intent to respond to some of the questions. We intentionally didn't provide a letter of support, mostly because we were so well integrated into the process and really support the work that was done to try to harmonize some of the work that is already being done, noting that this is a critical tool, especially maybe not for some of the larger developers, but absolutely for many of the nonprofit developers that we want to help make it easier to get through those initial stages related to development. So these tools aren't really necessarily all for the depth of affordability, but they are absolutely the tools that are required to advance affordable development. And you only get to that depth of affordability if you can make it easier for developers, large and small, to be able to advance on the projects that they need to advance on. And this to us is absolutely a critical tool, and one that, as you know, from back a couple of years ago and even back to our business case, was one that we really saw a primary need for, as did planning. And what we are very excited about, as LDI just said, is to begin some of the work on some of the next tools that also stack in that same way. And, and just to the point related to the function of integration, a tool like this is being done fully within our existing and available resources and is really intended to harmonize within those resources. So this is not just, it's not about being more work, it's actually less work. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other comments from the public? I'm not seeing any, so I will look to committee to close the public participation meeting. Moved by Councillor Hopkins, seconded by Councillor Keabaga.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
Thank you. So I have taken a few notes here that staff, some were comments and some were questions that I'm just hoping staff can address. Are we taking money away from building housing for more towards the people on OW or ODSP and other rent geared to income type buildings? Is there a consideration of repayment of these loans through the property taxes? What about building housing that's needed for those with lower incomes than would be considered in this affordable little envelope? And there was a comment that this isn't necessarily providing any incentive for larger developers to avail themselves of this program.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair, I'll try to go through all those. And I'll start on the ways of collecting the money and pay through the property taxes. These loan agreements, and we've been doing this for a while with all of our incentive programs, they actually are registered on title, so the city is protected. The method of payment, though, is set out in the loan schedule, and we've not had to go to a property tax method of collecting. In fact, it seems to be easier to actually just pay as is laid out in the schedule of the loan agreement. And I would also note, particularly as it relates to the, I'll call it the larger building incentive program, the loan program for the multifamily, the repayment schedule proposed on that is actually just 3 repayments, and they're all very quick. They're all in the front end of the process because they're very much tied to the actual construction of the building. So the monies would be advanced up front upon completion of the application, and then the payback schedule is within 60 days of the building permit, then with the framing, and then with the occupancy of the building. So that is tied to milestones, and that payback would come very quickly at the front end. The other thing I would also note is, as part of the loan agreements, again, to Mr. Brown's point, these are transferable upon consent of the city, so those loans could be granted or could be transferred to a subsequent owner on the property, or they can be paid back at any time because they are interest-free. And in most instances, with property transfers, they've actually been paid back because it's usually easier. With respect to the comments from Ms. Melrose, she in fact is 100% correct. These programs will not and cannot address those levels of affordability. Those levels of affordability are beyond what the market can take care of without the additional supports, and that's not the intent of this. And as Mr. Macbeth noted, these are just 2 programs that we're suggesting to you in the toolkit. There are other methodologies or other things that the city can do, and you're going to be seeing a lot of those things through the budget process already. But no question, this program does not address those deeper needs. This program tries to deal with the market and tries to deal with proportions of market affordability that's tied to the average market rent, and it will not go down to those levels. But having said that, the portion of it that deals with the secondary dwelling units could provide for deeper affordability perhaps not to that level of affordability, but to deeper levels of affordability, because by nature, these secondary dwelling units that are built as basement apartments or accessory apartments and existing dwelling units are below what the asking or average market rents are. So we're hoping, and again, that's part of our monitoring, is we have asked, as part of this program, we will be monitoring what rents are actually charged for the units created under this program. The other thing to address the comment is this money taking money out of another program? And no, that's not. The funding is from reserve fund to support a loan program. These are loans that will be paid back as people participate in the program. So the money that's coming is an upfront contribution from reserve fund to establish the reserve so that we can issue the loans that are then paid back. So this over time becomes self-funding. To Mr. Wallace's comments, again, thank you very much. And we did have this conversation about whether or not the larger builders would participate in this program. And again, at the $10,000, $15,000 to $20,000 per unit, that number was derived as a proxy for what the old development charges used to be. So in as much as that would work into the pro forma of a larger developer, Mr. Wallace has indicated we don't know. But certainly, I think, as Mr. Justicia has indicated, our conversations are that this, in fact, would work into the pro formas of perhaps not-for-profits or some smaller developers. So again, that's part of our monitoring. This is the city's first foray into this, and we're looking to see that, in fact, we do get some take-up on these programs and that we do, in fact, get the units developed. And I believe that was pretty much all the comments and questions that were raised.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Any comments or questions from committee? Deputy Mayor Helmer.
Well, I support the program. I think that this is a good way to get started with the CIP, and I think that switching to the zone-based average market rent was a good adjustment from what was brought forward initially. Just to give people a sense, because it's not really addressed directly in the report, and I had to look it up myself, but East London is the zone that's identified as number 8 in the CMHC geography. It's not quite what most people would think of as East London, but close enough. And the average market rent for a one-bedroom there in 2019 was $819. The average market rent in Zone 3, which is the part sort of just east of the university, North London, essentially it's North London is the name of the zone, is $1,019. So there's $200 difference between the two zones. They're very close together at the point of Oxford and Adelaide, like they're one's on the one side and the other one's on the other side. Southeast versus northwest of that intersection. And it's a $200 difference. So, I think that's a good example of how, if you're establishing an affordable market, an affordable unit in an area of the city, you can't have it be at just under $950 and say, oh, well, it's an affordable unit. That would not make sense to people when you put it into an area where the average market rent is actually $820. Right? If the one came in at the city average, it would be actually above what the average is in that area, and it would not make a lot of sense to people, I don't think. So I'm glad to see that we've adjusted it so that it will be relative to the area where it's being built. And I do think this is not the solution to all the affordability issues. I think it's one portion that's going to help on the construction of certain kinds of affordable buildings. I think smaller ones that are being done by people like the London Affordable Housing Foundation, like these are the kind of proponents where I think they're going to probably take advantage of this kind of program. People who might be taking on their first project, they don't have access to all the financing that major developers would have access to, or nor the financial strength to just go and borrow money in a normal way. And I think that this is going to be a piece that's missing. It's also happening in conjunction with a lot of other things that are happening, like at the federal level, the Canada Housing Benefit. It's not going to be available to everybody, but that's something on the order of $2,500 a year on average, probably be more in Ontario, and they're projecting that it's going to reach something like 300,000 people across the country. Right, that's a lot of money that will bring down, regardless of what kind of housing people are living in. It'll bring down the rent that they're facing. Essentially, it'd be like taking $200 off a month. with the Canada Housing Benefit. And that's on top of all these other things that are happening. So I do think if all different levels of government are coordinated and we're doing different things that are all helping, we're going to be able to make a difference in the overall problem, which obviously, as we know, is very big and very significant, from the folks who are living in core housing need now and are living in unsuitable shelter and need to get into better units, all the way to folks who are having trouble buying houses. Like, the affordability problem goes from the very lowest income people pretty far into the middle class at this point. And I think we have to do things all the way along the spectrum. And I think this kind of approach is making sure that we're not just doing things sort of in the upper middle part of the spectrum. It's starting to pull it down a bit further, which in conjunction with the housing benefit and some of those other things that are changing, I think will be helpful. At the city level, we have our own rent supplement program, which I think taps out around 250 or 300 households total for the whole city. But that was something that we did with the previous term of council that I think was a helpful thing. Again, it was $200 a month, if I remember correctly. So I'll support this. I think monitoring is going to be critical to see what actually happens, if the take-up is working, was the program design effective? But I think this is a good start.
Thank you. Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks for the report. I'm generally supportive. I think, like Deputy Mayor Helmer, I think that monitoring is going to be crucial. And maybe I could just follow up with a question. As we proceed with applications, we understand that the monitoring would start once the building has been built, and then it goes the 10 years. Would it have to, so sometimes the building, the application is applied for when the building is built. Say if the application is not applied for at that time, is there opportunities, or is it very strict with the application process that it's done right at the beginning and too late, so sad kind of thing if it's built?
Through the chair, the programs are not retroactive. You have to enter the loan agreement before undertaking the works.
Good. And I can see this program, just like other CIPs that we have in the city, loan programs, very beneficial, especially to smaller not-for-profit groups or smaller developers, builders. And I think there's a need for that. And generally, the opportunity for them to take advantage of CMHC's funding and the co-funding that probably exists when you go through that process, paying for DCs, things like that are pretty important. But it's another tool in the kit, and for that, I think the more we can do. Social housing, community housing is not what we're talking about here tonight, and I think that has to be understood and underlined when we do talk about affordable housing.
Anybody else? Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good work, committee. I think this is one of the best examples of how valuable it is to work with the community when we're coming up with policy. Because I think it was unexpected that developers would want the money, would want to pay the money back quickly rather than over a longer period of time. And of course, that makes this program even more effective. It's kind of like a catalyst, which is something that speeds up a reaction but isn't consumed in the reaction. So it's nice to see that we'll speed up the development without consuming the taxpayers' resources. So great. I was very happy with this and how it came about. I think it's pretty focused too on the two programs. That makes it really easy to pass.
Thank you, Councillor. Anyone else? I have a question to staff. So you mentioned that the loan per unit is approximately relative or equal to what the development charges would be. So if affordable housing project were to be built, say in the downtown, could they take advantage of both the DC charges program that we have to encourage residential development downtown plus this?
Through the chair to the chair. Actually, all of our programs are stackable. That's what we call it. So we try to encourage, if the city is if it's in the public interest to try to promote these kinds of things as much as possible, we look to provide as many of the incentives that council's put forward that would promote these types of things. So short answer, yes.
Thank you. So just a few comments from the chair. I'm glad to hear that. I think when you stack all of the incentives that are available, that will encourage developers of all sizes to participate in something like this. We have the development charges incentive program for building downtown, plus this incentive program. And this incentive program allows them access to federal dollars through the National Housing Strategy. So you have program stacked upon program stacked upon program, which will encourage the larger developer to take advantage of something like this. And it's the larger developer that has the resources, in my view, to really go crazy here and really help the community out, help the city out with some a big influx of affordable housing stock in the city, which is what we really need. Again, as the staff have reported out, as councillors have pointed out, this is not the only tool. This is not the way we're going to solve homelessness and the dire need that we have in the city for community housing or social housing, rent geared to income housing. This is one tool in a big toolbox. And what I've seen over the last 5 years that I've been talking about these kinds of things, I've seen greater emphasis on housing, affordable housing, social housing, and creation of new units. And I've seen that the momentum building. And so I think our toolbox is getting really big now, and that's really helpful. I really liked the part in the report where you talk about people that may have graduated from the need for social housing. They're ready to move to an affordable unit, but there aren't any out there. So when we have availability of these kinds of units and people ready to graduate because their economic circumstances have improved, they're ready to move to affordable, that can free up some of these other kinds of housing for people that really do need them. So I think everything in our housing toolkit works together like this, and we need all of this available, all of these tools available to us. And again, we can do multiple things at once. Focusing on, we're at the planning committee. This is where we focus on things like community improvement plans. When we're talking about London community housing and rent geared to income housing, social housing, that generally is dealt with at Community and Protective Services Committee. So it's not like we're a single focus council where we have multiple things going on at the same time and we're able to do all of those things at the same time. We have funding, or we try to make funding available through the budget process for multiple things going on at the same time. I add my thanks to everybody that's already said so, to staff for this report, for turning it around pretty quickly. We've been talking about it for a few months now, and every time a report has come back, you've advanced it that much further down the road. So thank you. It's a great report. It's a good plan. I'm glad we're going to be monitoring it so we can see down the road what we need to tweak or fix or change or improve, or everything might be great. So again, thanks. And if there are no other comments, I'm looking for a motion from the committee, moved by Deputy Mayor Helmer, moving the staff recommendation, seconded by Councillor Keabaga. And if there's nothing else, we can vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
That brings us to items for direction, and there is one item for direction, number 4.1, an application pertaining to 536 and 542 Windermere Road. Go ahead, Mr. Tomazinski.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Since it's an item for direction, there's no formal presentation. But just to quickly summarize, in April of 2019, Council approved the zoning bylaw for these lands. And as part of that approval, Council resolved that through a future site plan process, that the trees on the westerly and northerly boundary be protected and be preserved. Now, that zoning bylaw amendment has since been appealed, and the applicant and the appellant, who's the neighboring property owner, are in the process of settling this appeal. And as part of that appeal, the two parties have expressed a preference to have the northern trees replaced rather than retained. And while staff are not opposed to this idea, there's still the resolution then that exists. And so site plan staff will have to take that into account as part of any future site plan application. So this is a bit of a different request because it doesn't involve any zoning bylaw amendments. But what staff are recommending is that as a result of the council procedure bylaw, that resolution be reconsidered. And that's our recommendation being put forward at this time.
Thank you. Any questions from committee? Deputy Mayor?
No questions, but I'm happy to move a reconsideration. It seems like the conflict is being resolved in a different way than we had originally intended, but it's still being resolved, so I think it's reasonable.
Councillor Hopkins?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I'm glad a better solution has come about, and okay with the reconsideration as well.
So this will be a recommendation to council that council reconsider the motion that was passed, and it's moved by Deputy Mayor Helmer, seconded by Councillor Hopkins. If there are no other questions or concerns or comments, we can vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
So that will go to council. And now we'll move to item 4.2, which is a submission from Councillor Van Holst. And I'll go to Councillor Van Holst if you would like to introduce this item.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I know that the province is looking at some different ways to deal with community benefits, but in the meantime, I've recognized a challenge that we might be able to deal with regarding the park dedication bylaw. And I've seen in the past where groups have tried to create a place of worship. We've asked for the same kind of money in lieu of parkland dedication as we would ask a developer splitting up land and selling those units. And it turns out to be it can be a lot of money to raise in the collection plate. So my concern is the ability to pay, and I'm suggesting that we might be able to help with that by changing our request to either bring that amount for those kinds of groups down to 2% like the commercial properties would be, or make that exempt like the industrial properties would be. So we've got sort of 3 tiers there, and maybe those groups would be better served on another tier. The other question that I want to bring up in this discussion is how that evaluation is made. I know a group has been asked to provide a value of the property, but not a value of the land. So the value of the property implies that we're asking how much their existing property is. So someone's looking to make an addition onto an existing temple, and we seem to be asking for 5% of the value of the existing temple as well. So I think that's not really intended in the dedication bylaw. So looking to see if there's a way that we can change this for the people that are developing new properties in the short term.
Thank you, Councillor. I wonder if staff would like to respond or comment?
Hi, through you, Madam Chair. The Parkland Dedication Bylaw is based on the Planning Act, which allows for 5% residential and other land uses and 2% commercial. We've applied it, we created a bylaw, an implementation bylaw in 2010, and consistently have applied it to places of worship, to commercial, and this application is no different. So we've been consistent in our application.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased that we're generally consistent with the bylaw. So what my hope is, Madam Chair, is that we'll change our bylaw. And that being in the act, it says that we may charge up to 2% for commercial properties and up to 5% for residential and other properties. So it's up to us what those percentages are. And I think in light of the ability to pay, for instance, in these cases, we're generally taking a smaller property and they don't have the advantage of being able to split it up and sell market value units. So I don't consider it fair, and it seems to be quite a hardship for them. I've seen it happen in the past. I would like to make us a change. So I'm putting this forward to our committee to request we move forward on something like that. But maybe I can ask through you to our staff when we think we'll see some changes in Bill 108. When will the province come forward with something different?
Through you, Chair. And I'll answer the last question first. Your guess is as good as ours. We're waiting for the regulations to come down. We've looked into, and we're starting to prepare for the implementation of Bill 108 and Bill 138. And looking at the CBC charges, the community benefit charge, which will replace the parkland dedication and other aspects of that, and the removal of removal of portions of the development charges. So we're waiting for those. We have no idea. The province hasn't given us an indication as terms of when the regulations will come in. We've obtained a consultant to prepare for the CBCs. We're doing background research right now for those and the implementation of them. To go back to one of the other questions that was asked, the evaluation of the land, so the appraisal that's done, we asked for an appraisal to be done by an accredited appraiser, and the Planning Act says the value of the land. In this instance, and I'm not sure if we're talking about generalities or specifics, but I'll use this one in specifics. Under Section 42, it says the value of the land the day before the day of issuance of building permit, and the value of the land is what is on that land. So there's a land, is it serviced, is it zoned, does it contain buildings, what are its improvements? That's the value of the land. If the land had negative attributes, those would also be included in that value. So it could work either way. And that's the way that the Planning Act was intended, and that's the way that it has been interpreted, is what's the value of the land as it is of that day? Does it have zoning? Is it serviced? Does it contain buildings? And that's what the appraisal is done for. And again, we've been consistent in applying that since its implementation.
Thank you. Councillor Hopkins?
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you. I appreciate Councillor Van Holst's advocacy for his community and ways to help a place of worship, for instance, and the costs incurred here in this situation. I just want to understand, a place of worship and the zoning of the property, how is it applied? Is it considered residential or is it considered commercial? Or just trying to understand, is there a difference here, or what are we talking about in terms of what's being charged?
Sorry, through you, Madam Chair. In this situation, it is the place of worship is under the residential, the other. So 2% is applied to commercial lands, and then the other is captured under the 5%. And if we are talking about this one, we have looked at it. We've worked with different groups, whether it be places of worship, whether it be nonprofit, whether it be commercial properties. We've looked at providing other alternatives where land is appropriate. In this situation, we've also looked at a land dedication that may assist the city in a pathway connection, connecting both the existing community that's on the north, south, and west of this property to Clark Road Park, which is on the east side of Clark Road, that has connections both to the north and the south. So there are other opportunities that won't require them to provide funds, that we'd be able to utilize land, and it wouldn't cost them. I simply think the cost would be creating a reference plan, which is probably in around the $5,000 range, which they would have to do as part of their site plan in any event.
So that's the land dedication opportunity for the place of worship is still available there, and those discussions can continue. I would not be supportive of changing a bylaw right now. We're in the middle of trying to understand what Bill 108 looks like and CBCs, and I think if we're going to make changes to our bylaws, that's the time to do it once we understand what's going on. But I would encourage the applicant to work with staff to come up with other alternatives here that I think there are. Thank you.
Any other discussion? I have a question. So Councillor Hopkins asked a question, and the answer was about this site specifically, but so this is a place of worship, but it's in a residential zone? Is that correct?
It's based on the 5% is based on the classification of use, so it isn't a commercial use. So if it was a commercial use, it would be providing the 2% for the commercial use, but it's not determined to be a commercial use.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Councillor Van Hulst.
Thank you. If we were to make a change in this, would it require a public participation meeting? And I guess my last question is, are we at liberty to make these kinds of changes to a bylaw like this?
So you through Chair, it would be, if we're making an amendment to the bylaw, we would have to go through a public participation process. And we'd be opening up the bylaw to the public.
So a follow-up from me on that. If we were just going to, so does it say right in the bylaw that a place of worship is considered in the residential part and therefore the percentage is applied to a place of worship? Does it say that right in the bylaw?
No, it's actually taken from the Planning Act. So the Planning Act stipulates what can be taken, the parkland dedication. It's 2% for commercial lands, 5% for residential or other land uses. So it would fall under the other land uses.
Deputy Mayor Helmer.
I appreciate Councillor Van Hulst's persistence. I was on the governance working group when we dealt with a number of policy reviews, and one of them was the cash in lieu for parkland dedication. Councillor Van Hulst made a number of the same points he's making now. Then we actually dealt with this matter in 2018, I think, where we actually did have a public participation meeting about parkland dedication bylaw. We made a couple of amendments back then, not the kind of amendments that Councillor Van Hulst is suggesting. I think the idea that the nature of the proponent is something we should be factoring into how much land we require for parkland. I don't like the approach. So I can understand the problem, which is certain kinds of proponents don't have the money to cover the cost. And I think we have to think about how to fix that problem, but I'm not convinced at this point that the solution is change the bylaw to change how much is being calculated for certain kinds of proponents. I think looking at what is the redevelopment use of the land is the right way to do it. And then if there's a grant program or something that needs to be in conjunction with that to lower the cost for people for some other reason, like they don't have the ability to pay or something like that, that would be my preferred approach than changing the calculation method. But I think at this point, I'd like to receive the communication. It sounds like there's a specific project that's underway, which is motivating the general change, and I'm a little concerned that there may not be a huge amount of time to be even having the public participation meeting, changing it, all that stuff, if it's actually going to meet the requirement anyway. But I'm certainly open to hearing more from Councillor Van Hulst about how we could address this issue. I'm just not convinced at this point that that's the right way to do it.
So you're moving that, or Deputy Mayor? Is there a second? Seconded by Councillor Keabaga. Any other comments? Okay, we'll vote on that.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
And I don't know of any deferred or matters or additional business, so I will look for a motion to adjourn. Moved by Councillor Keabaga, seconded by Councillor Hopkins. We'll vote on screen. We already have the on-screen thing going, so look, it's there.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.